Here is a sign-in sheet for today. You got back last night your bibliographies with comments. Make sure you look at there are two sets of comments, right? The ones that are on the bibliography itself, the one you submitted to me, are mostly about format issues and things like that. However, if you look at the grading rubric under each of the sections, for many or most of you, I made very specific comments, unless you just like nailed it, right? But I mean, hey, look at this article. Try to find that book, right? Or, and sometimes this was on the actual bibliography. Say this is a great place to start, right? So there's lots of suggestions within that for you to move forward. That was again part of doing that was to sort of guide you in the right direction. Your progress report, right, which is you be continuing to do the research, is due on Thursday, right? And we went over that already, right? So at least two sources. Get started on your research, right? What is the author trying to do with that source on the one hand, but also how does it help your research? What are you finding out about your artist, about the period, about the kind of artwork that you're dealing with, right? And in addition to that, something about the author's authority, right? Something about what gives them credibility. Where did they study? And we went over this, how you can find that information, right? You can do a library search or a database search on our library for the author's name, find out what other things they've written. You can find it out online as well by doing an open Google search. I rarely say that, right? But in this particular case, if you do find something online, make sure you verify it, especially if you're looking for an author named John Brown or something like that, right? Because you want to make sure you've got the right one. So double check. Where did they go to school? What else have they written? What kind of jobs have they held down? What makes them an authority on your artist or the period, right? We don't want to get our information from just anyone, okay? So be sure you look over the instructions, look over the sample, make sure yours looks like the sample before you turn it in. That's due on Thursday, anytime, right? Thursday. It doesn't have to be by 8 o'clock in the morning, okay? Any questions on that? I will get those comments back to you a whole lot faster, I promise. I think the skies are clearing a little bit, so I'm able to sort of get back on top of things. And you should expect more of your worksheets. I'm going to grade the worksheets back to front. That way you get feedback on the stuff that might be on the final sooner than later, right? And so we'll work our way back from that. So you get 10 and 9 first, okay? Okay. We were talking about Baroque Holland, right? The Baroque period is a period of sort of drama in a lot of different forms. However, Baroque Holland is a little bit less dramatic than the others, in part because they're not Catholic, right? They're Protestant. And there are elements of Baroque Holland that are crucial to why the art looks the way it does in Holland, okay? On the one hand, like I said, they're not Catholic. So the subject matter that's chosen by the artists is very different from the rest of Europe. No saints, right? Or very few. There's a few scattered examples because there's one part of Holland that is in fact Catholic. But the majority of things are secular subject matter, right? For really kind of the first time in this class, we're really dealing with non-Christian subject matter. Landscapes and still lives, right? It's kind of modern art in a way. We're making a step toward the modern age this way. So on the one hand, not Catholic. On the other hand, there's no regency. There's no royalty there. It's a democracy, right? So we don't have another staple of Baroque and Renaissance pictures, which are portraits of royalty, which we talked about almost everywhere else. Right? So that's different as well. That democratization of the country is, I think, on a certain level, leads to the third thing, which is that we have a really broad base of people who are buying pictures. Right? It's not limited to the aristocratic few. And everybody who visits Holland comments on how many people own pictures. And indeed, 17th century Dutch art, there is so much that survives from this period because, religious zealots wouldn't want to attack it, right? At a point when that kind of religion fell out of favor. But over and above that, there were just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of paintings being produced, right? Rembrandt alone, right? Anywhere between 300 and 800 paintings, right? Jacob van Ruisdael on your right, about 200 landscapes in his career. This gives you, and that's what survives, right? That's what's still around today. So that gives you some clue as to exactly how many of these things are out there. And artists, this kind of leads to our fourth thing. Artists are specialists, right? We talked about this a couple times over. Artists are specialists. So Van Ruisdael is a landscape painter. That's really all he does. He doesn't try to do other kinds of painting because he's trying to do well one little corner of this amazingly huge market, right? Willem Heyde, on your left, does only still life painting. And many of them look very much like this. Many of Van Ruisdael's landscapes resemble elements that we see here because they're speeding production, right? If you kind of do the same pewter pots and the same glassware and whatnot, right, you can throw them out there, right? You've sped the plow. You've increased your production line by regularizing things. And what we find with Heyde, for example, is he'll have many of the same articles will appear in numerous still lifes, but in different scales, right? Just change them around to make the composition more pleasing, right? But redeploy them in different ways, and you can walk then into Heyde's studio and say, I want a still life. On this one, it's huge. It's about like this, right? It's about 4.5 feet across. Or you can get a little one, right? Or you could get one, I don't like the glass on its side. Can you give me something else that's a little bit less sort of about life's precariousness and death and all of that? Yeah, here's one over here, right? Or can I have one that's more like that? Yeah, here's one with a skull, right? They would specialize within these, and this really made them sort of modern capitalist producers of paintings, right? And I don't mean that in a negative way. So when we looked at Vermeer, we saw how similar many of his compositions were. He worked for a very limited clientele, but still he seemed to have sort of conventionalized his compositions, and he did only genre scenes. And within that, he did primarily, not exclusively, but primarily images of women alone, caught in a moment of reflection. That's his great specialty, his best pictures, right? Frans Hals, only portraits. Some genre scenes as well, but they both are equally lively and vibrant, right? These are specialists. And that's part of the art market in Holland, is that people try to specialize. With one notable exception. Rembrandt, right? The most famous artist from the 17th century does not try to specialize. Rembrandt tries to be all things to all people. He really does a little bit of still life. He does a little bit of landscape. Actually, there's quite a bit of landscape, at least in his printmaking, not so much as a painter. Right? His great desire from day one was to be seen as a great painter. And part of that ambition was the number of self-portraits that he did. We haven't seen any definable self-portraits, well, Velázquez, but that's roughly the same time as this, right? Rembrandt does dozens and dozens of self-portraits in painting, even more in printmaking, also in drawing. He seems to be really interested in his own face and selling these things. That's part of this sort of creation of a cult around himself, right? He has ambition to be seen as a great painter. And in 17th century Holland, great painters painted a kind of picture we haven't seen yet. In 17th century Holland, there was a hierarchy of painting, right? The most menial kinds of painting were like still lives and landscapes. They were cheap. They weren't very well respected by critics. right? At the top of the heap were history paintings. And by history paintings, what the critics meant was anything with a narrative, right? So this could be a mythological scene from ancient Roman mythology. It could be a real history, something from Rome, or it could be a biblical scene. These were all under the umbrella of history painting, right? And that was seen as the most noble profession because it required the most talent from the artist. Because you had to put still life into it, because you had to paint the human figure, right? The human figure was key, but you also had to sometimes put it in a landscape or an architectural setting. So all of the other genres kind of led to this, right? And that's what Rembrandt wants to be from day one. He's going to be a great artist. He's going to be a history painter. That's his ambition. So when he's painting his self-portraits, not only is he sort of spreading this cult of how great he is, right? And these things would sell, right? He's not just painting them for himself, but he would turn around and market these things. I am Rembrandt, right? Way before he's a toothpaste, yeah? Marketing, but he's also really interested in using his own face to study expression. So that when he paints a history painting, he can make each person in the story have an individualized expression because he's become a master of human emotions, master of expression, right? So these are in one way a study, using his own face so that he can sit down and paint a crucifixion scene or a Roman history scene or a mythological scene and give them human characteristics. And that is arguably Rembrandt's greatest strength as an artist, is the humanity that he brings to his scenes. It's extraordinary, right? I've been teaching Rembrandt at 2 different levels, upper division and graduate level this semester, and I'm blown away again. I'm getting back into him. You know, it's easy to forget because he's so popular. But what an amazing painter he is. Just extraordinary. Nice detail here, right? Get a look into his eyes close up. Also extraordinary about Rembrandt is this sort of open-ended way in which he paints. As you look at his nose, look at all of the layers of paint that are there and how he's really interested in gumming it up, right? It ends up sitting thick on the surface. And we get this little area of green underneath, right, of greenish gray that he's painted the flesh tones over the top of. But as you follow him painting, you can see what he's doing is he's building up the paint almost as if he's building up the actual skin. So that the bags under his eyes are bags of paint. Right? Or the brow over his eyes, over his eyebrows, right? The forehead are thick areas of paint, and the brush follows the skin around. I always got the sense with this, if the National Gallery would let me, that I can make a rubbing of this painting, and you can see his face, right? From the way in which he's laid the paint down. But if we look into his face, he's 53. Right? He's born in 1606, right? Is that right? No, yes, 1606. He's 53 years old. Looking kind of bad for all of that, right? I'm coming up on 59. I think I don't quite look that bad, right? He's got a lot more wrinkles than I do. And it's because he had a relatively hard life, but he depicts himself very down to earth. He doesn't try to make himself pretty. He uses the portrait as a way to sort of dive deeply into his soul and try to figure out how the outer appearance of someone reflects an inner characteristic, almost pleading and sad. And at this point in his life, things aren't going so well. He's had to declare bankruptcy in 1656, right? His first wife has died of tuberculosis, right? He's had numerous problems with moral authorities for about 15 years at this point, right? He's had one son who's survived. So he had tough, right? And you see some of that in the way in which he looks at us sort of unflinchingly, right? Honestly. And that's, I think, part of that humanity that Rembrandt brings is that level of honesty. Like I said, he did lots of portraits throughout his entire career, lots of self-portraits throughout his entire career. Here he is, age 22, right? And in each of these, he does this nifty little trick. He's really interested in the physical properties of paint. And one of the things he does a lot in his portraits is he'll come back in and he'll take the paintbrush and he'll turn it around backwards and he'll use like the eraser end of it, but it's just a point on the paintbrush, and he'll scratch into the wet paint. And you can see on his hair, that's exactly what he's done to get the highlights of hair, is he's come back and he's scratched at the wet paint. And even in ours, just over his temple on your right, you can see he's doing exactly the same thing to give you those highlights, right? He's manipulating the paint on the surface of the canvas. So these self-portraits are on one hand, excuse me, elevating status, right? He wants people to know who he is. He has ambition to be a great painter. But on the other hand, he's studying expressions, the fall of light across the face. And all of this is going to feed his greater ambition of being a history painter, right? A great artist in the eyes of the critics. In addition to doing studies of himself, he also did costume studies. He collected this huge trunk full of exotic cloths, metals, right? We know this from when he went bankrupt, because he had to have an inventory drawn up of everything he owned because he had to sell it in 16. So he knew he had this huge collection of stuff, right? Furs and felts and cheap costume jewelry, right? And pieces of metal that he would then pose people in, dress them up and pose them. And those two were meant to feed his history painting, because he has these now exotically costumed figures who could figure in a Roman mythology, right? Or in a historical picture or in a biblical picture, right? And Rembrandt does do biblical pictures. We do have religious art in Holland. But for Rembrandt, he's interested in religion because of the human nature of things. Great human stories, right? That's what draws him to religious works. At the same time, these things had a market. He could turn around and sell them, right? So Rembrandt is very much interested in trying to become a great history painter. Now, the other issue, of course, is that he's got to make ends meet, right? He's got to survive as an artist. So how does any artist survive in an economy that doesn't really need them, right? You figure out ways to get people to buy your stuff. And so he's creating this myth of himself, and people want these. He can sell these. He also becomes a portrait painter, right? A very much in demand portrait painter in the 1630s. And the critics who talked about history painting being at the top really talked about portrait painting being way at the bottom. Because when a portrait painter, if I paint a portrait of Khadijah, you get to tell me what you want to look like. I don't get to make a lot of choices here, right? And if you don't like what I've done, you can just say, screw you, I'm not going to pay you, right? So you're really at the beck and call of somebody else. And that, for the critics, was like, okay, no artistic license, right? That was the worst of the worst. But they all acknowledged you got to do it because, man, it pays really well, right? So Rembrandt did portrait paintings as well to help make ends meet. He also ran a studio where he taught students, and he had more than was normal, again, to make ends meet. He married up the social ladder. He married the niece of his boss, who was running an art gallery. She brought a huge dowry, which helped a lot, right? She's the one that died of tuberculosis, right? He was working the market, trying to become a successful artist in every possible way, not only monetarily, but with the great respect of people around him, right? But like I said, his great interest was to become a history painter, right? And these are the things that he really sort of had the ambition to do. We have some somewhat late in his career, right? He's in his 50s here, so this is around the same time as that self-portrait. A history painting that Rembrandt has done, right? And it shows a Roman mythological scene. Philemon and Baucis is an impoverished peasant couple, and they're on the left, right? These two figures here, almost swallowed in the darkness. Right, and here they are, right? Philemon and Baucis, and they have this farm, and they're visited by this pair of people that they don't recognize, right? And they open their doors to them and welcome them in. Now, it turns out that the people that they're welcoming in are Jupiter and Mercury. Jupiter, the king of the gods, and Mercury, his messenger. And they've been, according to the myth, they've been walking around town looking for a place to stay, and all of the rich people have shuttered their doors against them, right? They won't take them in because we don't want you, right? And they're disguised, so they don't recognize them, right? And so all the people who could afford to help them don't. And then they finally wind up at the farm of poor Philemon and Baucis, impoverished Philemon and Baucis, and they welcome them in with open arms, right? There's a message here, right? Rich suck, the poor good-hearted people, right? And if we look at the time frame of this is 2 years after Rembrandt's bankruptcy. So this idea of poverty having higher moral value, higher moral richness, is for Rembrandt an important theme, right? So Philemon and Baucis offer them in. They start to give them wine, right? Which they don't have much of. And every time they pour the glass of wine, you see Mercury's got a glass in his hand. Every time they pour the glass of wine, they look in the pitcher and it's still full. It's going to be getting question what's going on here, right? And then they're about to offer Jupiter and Mercury their prized possession, which is this big fat goose that they have, right? Here, we will share with you what food we have, right? Our last prized goose. And at that point, Jupiter says, no, you don't have to. You've proved yourself. And he reveals himself to be who he is, which is the king of the gods, right? And so we see the moment of revelation. That's what the light is meant to symbolize, the divine light, right? Philemon and Baucis are just recognizing that their guests are not who they thought they were. But they were kind to them regardless, right? They were kind to them out of the kindness of their heart, not because they were gods, right? And Jupiter has his shiny silver armor on, right? There's that extraordinary light. So does Mercury, that extraordinary light behind Mercury's head. And you can see, Philemon, I think, is the guy. He's got his hands together, right, as he recognizes this. And Rembrandt now tells this story, right? Not all in sort of very human terms. He puts it in this rustic shed. Certainly shows us sort of this human interchange of God and man. And even though it's the moment of divine revelation, Rembrandt becomes interested in human interchange, which is, again, that great strength of his. Now, who's influenced this painting? The basic style of the painting reminds you of whom? Say it, I heard it. Caravaggio, indeed, right? Darkened interior, bright light. It doesn't flow in like Caravaggio, right? It's kind of hidden behind Mercury rather than coming in on a dramatic angle. But the limited color palette around ochre, right? Earth tones highlighted with oranges and yellows comes directly out of Caravaggio, right? Actually, it's wrong to say it comes directly out of Caravaggio because it comes indirectly out of Caravaggio. Rembrandt never went to Italy. He might have seen one Caravaggio on sale in Amsterdam, but he never visited Rome. In fact, a friend of his, very well placed in Dutch society, suggested that he should travel to Rome, and he said there's no reason. I can see all the great art here in Amsterdam, either in display in collections or up for sale, right? There's no reason I need to really travel to see great Italian art. And Rembrandt is picking up on Caravaggio because a number of other Dutch painters had gone to Rome and came back to Holland making Caravaggio-inspired works. And those are the ones that Rembrandt saw, right? So when I say the style comes directly out of Caravaggio, it's a little inaccurate. It comes indirectly out of Caravaggio. But there is a line we can trace from Caravaggio to Rembrandt. Here is one of the Dutch followers of Caravaggio. He had been to Bruggen, had been to Italy, had seen Caravaggio. As you can see, it's pretty much the same composition in reverse. A little bit more colorful, but Caravaggio lighting, right? These are the works that Rembrandt would have been familiar with. These are what brings Caravaggio into Rembrandt's sphere of influence, right? How he picks up on that idea. I'd love to talk about Rembrandt forever. I want to show you one other work by him because while he was active as a painter, both in portraits and histories, right, he was also active as a printmaker. And in fact, the prints, I think, for my money, my own personal preference, are significantly stronger. These are some of the greatest printmaking efforts ever done by anybody. And he's working in a different kind of printmaking than we've talked about before, right? We've talked primarily about engraving, right? Where the artist takes a sharpened tool like a plow and literally digs at a metal plate, right? So you have a steel point and you're dragging it through metal and you're cutting out, right, little pieces of metal. That's what Dürer did, right? That's what the prints that we saw from the Fontainebleau school did, right? Bruegel, right? Okay, so we've seen numerous examples of engraving. Rembrandt's doing what's called etching. And the technique achieves a sort of similar end through a different means. I don't think I have a marker in here. Okay. What you're trying to achieve as a printmaker is a varied surface, a flat surface with variations on it, where the variations will all transfer ink one way or another. Okay? And with engraving, you cut the lines, you rub the ink down into the lines, and you polish it off the flat bits, right? And then you put a piece of paper over the top of it, you run it through a press, and the press pushes the paper down into those grooves, and it pulls the ink out. And the idea is that each and every impression can be exactly the same, right? Much like a newspaper printer, right? Okay, that's engraving. The problem with engraving is the resistance that you get in carving those lines. It's very difficult to sort of be free sketchy with that because you get some resistance, right? Rembrandt and other artists, beginning sort of late 16th century, but Rembrandt's one of the great at this, works with a new technique where you take the flat copper plate with no design on it whatsoever, and you cover it with a very, very thin layer of a wax-based mixture. It's got some asphaltum in it and some other chemicals. It's pretty noxious stuff, right? But you cover it with this really thin layer. You heat it up a little bit with a candle from the other side, and it smooths out. Covers the entire plate with this wax-based stuff, right? You can then draw with a needle through the wax, like a knife through butter. It's sketchy. And what you do is you bear the plate through that wax. And what you then do is you immerse it in acid, right? And the acid will eat the plate wherever you have drawn. But the wax will resist it, keep it from touching the plate. So you end up, at the end, you clean off the wax, and you've got the grooved lines already made without that digging, right? All you've done is just drawn through the wax, and you get the ability to do sketchy lines. Look at the upper right corner of the three trees, right? How sketchy the lines are, right? That's the great benefit of etching. So what you do is you cover it with this thin, waxy layer. You draw through it with a needle, right? You then take it and you immerse it in acid. Rembrandt obviously didn't have plastic tubs, right? What he did was he bought some wax and he would build it up around the edge of the plate and he would pour the acid right on the plate, right? This acid is watered down, right? You stick your finger in it. It's not Breaking Bad, the basement of Breaking Bad, right? It's not body disposal strength, right? What it is, it's been watered down enough that you can stick your finger in it, and if you're not going to make cuts, it's not going to hurt. Get in your eyes, you're in trouble, right? Don't want it in your mouth, right? Don't want it in the open wounds, right? But you obviously wouldn't want to drink it, right? But it will eat copper slowly but surely, right? Over a course of about 20 minutes, it'll eat through parts of the copper, right? And you figure out how long it's going to take to etch. You pull it out, and then you clean it off, and then you do the inking process just like you would with an engraving, right? So Rembrandt is working with etching to make his prints. And what happens is then you get the plate, and from the plate you can make multiples. We go back to this idea that Rembrandt is trying to market himself, right? Rembrandt is very much trying to make a living as an artist. Prints were an extraordinary way to do that. Because with a painting, when you get done with all the trouble to make the design on a painting, you've got one that you can sell. But with a print, when you get done making the design, you can keep printing them. And we know that even though he signed and dated many of these, right, this is dated to 1643, we know from the papers that he's using that he continued to print it year after year after year through the rest of his life. Steady source of income for him. All that said, he was a horrible money manager, right? He's a profligate spender, and this led to his eventual bankruptcy in 1656, right? So, that's the technique, right? You come back in, and the longer you leave it in the acid, the deeper the line will get. Rembrandt's very good about sort of stopping areas out and making the lines lighter and leaving other areas open longer to make them deeper, right? And he does etchings of every kind of subject. Over 300 surviving designs in etching. Self-portraits, studies of beggars around Amsterdam, biblical scenes, historical scenes, and landscapes. Right? This is the one place where Rembrandt does a lot of landscapes. And it's kind of fascinating because the moment that Rembrandt begins to do landscapes, 1640, he's pretty deep into his career now. He's 24 years old. No, 34 years old. Right? He's been painting for about 10 years in Amsterdam. He's pretty successful. But the time that he gets into landscape painting is the moment his wife gets sick. Saskia, we think, had tuberculosis, and she was more or less bedridden off and on for 2 to 3 years before she died, right? And Rembrandt does numerous sketches of her sick in bed at various points in her illness, right? And it's exactly at that time, and like I said, she eventually dies in 1642. It's exactly at that time that Rembrandt begins to wander around the landscape and make sketches, right? He makes sketches in sketch pads, but it seems that he may have carried plates with him outside and made sketches directly on the plate. However, a great number of these are composed back in the studio from sketches he made outside. It's really tempting because of the humanity of Rembrandt's work to read them autobiographically. And the landscapes have often been looked at that way. Saskia is sick. She's being looked after by a nurse at home. Rembrandt's kind of freaked out, goes out for a spot of fresh air, right? Goes out to recharge the batteries, right? To look at nature, to reflect on life, to deal with the trauma of a bedridden, extraordinarily sick wife, right? And then after she's dead, even more of them, right? For the next 10 years is hundreds of landscape images in drawing and print. And it's kind of romantic and charming to think about Rembrandt sort of mourning the loss of his wife and moving. This is the year after she's dead, right? And going out into the landscape and trying to find some answers to life's bigger questions, like why does it matter, right? After this point, and we know that they were deeply in love, right? Saskia and Rembrandt. Very few marriages functioned on that level, right? But they were very, very deeply in love. If we look at the three trees, you'll notice that there's some drawing on the left, and he's come back over the top with a straight edge and just sort of drawn this storm. And as we read the image and we see the swirl of clouds, there's this idea that the storm has passed off to the left, right? It's moving away and pushing beyond. And when we look at that storm on the left and we think, Rembrandt's life, the storm is past, right? Saskia's finally passed. Her suffering is over, and Rembrandt can now sort of look to the future. And we see this print being composed around the rain on the left, the driving rain handled by these diagonal lines. And then on the right, there's a little artist sitting on a hill, sketching and looking to a brighter future, looking off toward the sunshine with his back to the storm. And like I said, it's really interesting to read these things autobiographically. It's tempting to do so. And there's, I think, something here. He loves putting little artists out there making sketches, and we can imagine this, while it's not a self-portrait, being a surrogate for Rembrandt, going out and sketching in the landscape. And what these etchings do is they make you want to dive in and look at them really closely, because it's entirely made up by this network of drawn lines, right? Look at the tree above the artist. You could never make a line like that with an engraving tool. Sort of loopy, Charlie Brown kind of line, right? Very simple, easily drawn. And as you look at it, it's only about like yay. This print's about like this big, right? We know that printmaking collectors would often keep these in boxes and would bring them out with the white gloves on and a magnifying glass to look at them. Right? And that's exactly the sort of interaction that they inspire. And Rembrandt invites us to sort of dive deep into this landscape and look and see all of the different characters that we can find. And I've got some nice details, right? This is a fisherman and his wife, right? She's holding the basket for him. He's got his rod cast into the marshy water. We see behind them the distant city. We've sort of come away from the town to find something in landscape. And then behind him we've got a shepherd, right? A cowherd. Tending after his cows in the landscape behind them. Right? Everywhere we look, we find little details that invite us to look even more closely. Horses and cows and figures wandering along the different avenues. And again, we talked about the fact that there's poetry of the time that talks about wandering around the countryside, right? And finding in nature inspiration. Okay? I think we still, like I said, I think we still do that. Why do you go camping? You know, what's the point of going camping? Because you want to get away from the city. So Rembrandt's doing that here, psychologically with his image. I'm sorry, this is digitally breaking up on us a little bit. We've got a horse cart. We know that intercity travel was really prominent in Holland. It's, like I said at the beginning, one of the most densely populated parts of all of Europe. And there were numerous ways you could get from Amsterdam to Haarlem, to The Hague, to Delft, right? Rotterdam, either by canal or by cart, right? This kind of travel was common. And we see a cart full of people going from one town to the next, and a little figure behind them coming up on our artists sitting on the hill. And all of this invites us to sort of stick our nose in as deep as we can. And if we do, and we really spend some time with the image, we start to see things that you might not notice. Down here in the bush is a couple making out, kissing, canoodling in the darkness. Can you see them? It's kind of hard within the shadow, right? But Rembrandt is inviting us to look. Right? See him now? She's got her side to us. He's leaning in. He's Joe Bidening her, right? Coming in from the side, got his arm around her back. Their knees are together. They're hiding in the bushes for some romantic purpose, right? And I think Rembrandt's got a great sense of humor. He's always including these details in his prints that keep us looking for more, keep us engaging with them. And it would be something that printmaker would have absolutely adored about his imagery. So there's Rembrandt for us. A great interest in humanity, a master of many different trades, has the great ambition to be a fantastic history painter, but does self-portraits, sort of feeding that, but also building his reputation, and then landscapes in printmaking in particular as a marketing tool, right, for print collectors. All of this helped him to make his career as a painter. We're going to wrap up the 17th century by looking at Baroque France, right? We've danced all around Europe now. We started off in Italy. We looked at Spain. We looked at the Spanish Netherlands. What's Belgium? We looked at Holland. We haven't really looked at France yet. What's going on in Baroque France, right? And a couple of things that are important, historically speaking, about France in the 17th century. While Holland and Belgium, modern Belgium, were engaged in the 80 Years' War, France was engaged in the 30 Years' War. The early part of the 17th century was a period of extraordinary warfare in Europe. Nearly every country through the course of the 17th century was involved in a war with one of the other European countries. Right? And France, even though they're predominantly Catholic, is at war with Spain on two different borders. They've got Spain to the south, they've got Spain to the north. And they're allied for a time with the Holy Roman Empire within this. It's a huge struggle, right? I'm sorry, Spain is allied with the Holy Roman Empire against France. So there's the 30 Years' War in France. It ends the same time as the 80 Years' War. It runs 1618 to 1648, but the French countryside is torn apart by the 30 Years' War. And what this means is that a number of French artists spend a significant amount of time elsewhere because the country of France is torn apart by war. And Simon Vouet, on the right, goes to Italy. Spends time in Italy. A lot of French artists go to Italy. Right? It's more peaceful than the French countryside. And Vouet goes there in the 1620s. Now, it's worth noting that Italy was particularly attractive to French artists because there had been so much Italian art in France. We looked at 16th century France before. We looked at the Palace of Fontainebleau. We saw that Francis I, the King of France, had imported French artists to decorate his palace. Italian art, did I say French artists? Francis I had imported Italian artists to decorate his palace in France. Right? Italian art was available everywhere in France. Not only could you see the original works by Rosso and Primaticcio, the copies after these in prints, you could also see works by Michelangelo that he had bought, the King of France. Works by Leonardo da Vinci that he had bought, the King of France. Right? Italian art was everywhere. And most French artists traveled to Italy at one point anyway. It was kind of expected. Go see the great stuff. Right? Go see ancient Rome. Go see the Sistine ceiling. Raphael's apartments. Right? Go see the great works in Italy. And Vouet is one of these. But he's also inspired by the fact that in 17th century France, the early part of 17th century, is marked by warfare. Right? Now, obviously, Vouet has also been looking at Caravaggio, hasn't he? I mean, it's really obvious the degree to which Caravaggio has this huge impact on artists who see his novel approach to religious painting. Right? Darkened background. Here's a Caravaggio. This is in the same chapel as the Calling of St. Matthew, and I think this is the closest one for Vouet, right? The darkened background, the theatrical spotlighting, the foregrounding of the figures in half length, putting them right up close and center, right? The color scheme, earth tones accentuated by reds and sometimes yellows, right? You would be right in mistaking this for a Caravaggio, right? Or at least wondering if it might be by him or one of his followers. But Vouet never met him, right? He got to Rome after Caravaggio was dead. And like most followers, he's not a pupil, right? He didn't study under Caravaggio. He saw the works and was well impressed, right? And mimicked them in his own works. Now, does anybody know anything about St. Jerome? Who was St. Jerome? Any good Catholics or historians out there? What was his claim to fame? Do you know? It's okay. I get it through art history, right? Art history is my church, right? In many ways. Jerome was responsible for translating the Latin version of the Bible. The official Latin version that the Catholic Church still uses was St. Jerome's translation. And he's like in the early 4th century, right? 300s. And at that point, the Bible was out there in numerous translations in numerous languages. He was a a philological scholar, right? He was a linguist kind of guy. And he could read Hebrew, and he could read Latin, obviously, right? And what he did was he went out and he took all the different versions and he sort of checked the translations, right, against the originals. Made sure they're right. So remember when we talked about Moses having horns? Did we talk about that in this class? We did, right? How there was that mistranslation about him coming down from Mount Sinai and he's supposed to shine, but it said, oh, he had horns. That was Jerome that fixed that, right? That was part of numerous things that he fixed in the Bible as he got out. So we see him hard at work. And the whole image, of course, is to suggest that this is his own work, but inspired by God, right? So we have the angel behind him with a trumpet, right? This is helping him with his translation. So it's not just the works of man. And on the table in front of him, right, he's got books and notes, right? And it's kind of fascinating because on the table in front of him, he's taken off his reading glasses as he's writing. And I think that's an important metaphor here, right? You can see he's got multiple quill pens, ink bottle open, a book on the left underneath that rag. But he's taken off his glasses. And that's because he's looking at the angel. You don't need your glasses to look at an angel, right? This is a miraculous appearance. It's not a physical thing he's looking at. So the idea that he's taken off his glasses is he's no longer relying on his physical abilities. He's channeling the spiritual power of God into his work. And the image is meant to show that Jerome is doing the work of God. Right? Next to the glasses, what's that other thing on the table? The round thing. The big, brown, round thing. Can you tell? Look at the shape of it. It's a skull. And it's looking directly at him. St. Jerome is often shown with a skull. And the reason he appears with the skull is he puts it on the table while he's working to remind himself of his own mortality. Thus, to keep his mind fixated, focused on spiritual work, the work of God. Because one day he will die, not give himself the pleasure of feeding his physical being. In art, we usually refer to things like this, appearances of a skull, as a memento mori, skeletons and skulls. They're reminders of death. Did we use that term before? I think we did with maybe it wasn't because we did Holbein online. Remember the skull in the foreground of the Holbein? Right? The distorted skull with the French ambassadors? Right? That too can be seen as a memento mori, a reminder of death. Right? A reminder of mortality. And so Jerome, having been looking at the skull and thinking about his work, is now visited by an angel, right? And he's focusing entirely on the spiritual work rather than any kind of physical comfort. And there are other elements that Vouet includes within this picture that also add to the idea of the shortness of life. And some of them we've seen elsewhere. Can you see anything else in here that reminds you of time passing, of light, of life ending? Things that we've seen in other things, Katrina? The hourglass, right? Down in the lower right corner is an hourglass. Anything else? We saw it in one of our still life paintings as well. Snuffed candle behind his shoulder, even though it appears to be at night. And here we get this again, that wonderful sort of juxtaposition between spiritual and physical, right? He's illuminated by the light of God, not by a human light behind him. But at the same time, a snuffed candle is often a symbol for the end of life, right? The end of, and so we saw it in that still life by Haida, in very much the same aspect. And then, as Katrina mentioned, on the table in front of him, right next to his work, is an hourglass, time ticking away, right? So rife with symbolism, and we'll see that Caravaggio is a huge influence on 17th century French art. He's one of three big influences on 17th century French art. One of my favorite pictures in the National Gallery is another French follower of Caravaggio. The term we use for these Caravaggio followers is Caravaggisti. Right? This is the fancy term for it. Followers of Caravaggio. And neither of these artists ever met him. Neither of them studied under him, but both were strongly influenced by his works. Vouet saw them directly. Georges Delatour stayed in France. He never went to Italy. He never saw Caravaggio. What he did see were works by Vouet, works by other artists who were influenced. So he's like Rembrandt. He's an artist secondhand, right? Indirectly influenced by Caravaggio. Velázquez is kind of the same way, right? Influenced by people who were influenced by Caravaggio. So here's Mary Magdalene. In Catholic countries during the Counter-Reformation, late 16th and into the 17th century, they're very much interested in penitence. These are symbols for you and me. Role models to follow, whether you're a man or a woman. Think about your life. Fix it. Right? Get everything in order. And here is Mary Magdalene at the moment of conversion. Right? This is the moment when she's still a prostitute. She's met Jesus and she's mulling it over. Thinking about conversion. She's repenting of her past life and turning her eyesight forward to her new following of Christ. And very much like Vouet, it includes these elements that relate to that idea of reflection, right? Thinking about life, thinking about death, right? Pondering that and thinking about what you're doing with your life. They're very moralizing pictures, right? So here she is, sort of just lost in thought, right? Illuminated by that candle. Delatour loves putting candles in pictures, but obscuring them by something, sort of blocking them as an internal source of light. And she's looking down at a mirror, right? And she's thinking about herself. Think of how many times we've seen metaphors like this. Vermeer, the woman with the scales, right? It's looking at a mirror or looking away from a mirror, right? Self-reflection through a very obvious physical reflection. And she sees her reflection in that mirror, right? Of course, she's got her hand on the skull, reminding herself of her own mortality as she thinks about it. But the way Delatour has arranged the picture, the mirror points enough toward us that when we look at the mirror, we don't see ourselves like she does. We see the skull from a different point of view. So what Delatour wants us to do is to use this picture as a surrogate, use this picture as a role model, right? Think about our own mortality, just like the Magdalenes does. You can't reach out and touch that skull, but you see it twice. And you should remember, right, that death comes to us all. And what are you doing to get ready for that? Very moralizing pictures. So Caravaggio is one of the great influences on French Baroque art, but he's not the only influence. Other artists who go to Italy, Nicolas Poussin primary among them, right, are not at all influenced in Caravaggio's work, not at all interested in it. Right? They instead begin to look at Raphael, Michelangelo, right? Renaissance art, firsthand. And Poussin has sort of an extraordinarily clear space, a composition without any real high drama. Almost all of the composition is horizontals and verticals, no dramatic diagonals. no theatrical lighting, right? It's very restrained by comparison. And that's because he's been looking at Renaissance art. And we refer to this sort of second strain of painting style in France as classicism. That less dramatic, more restrained style that we see in Poussin's work. This is down in Richmond, right? VMFA is, I think it's the first one we've seen from the VMFA. Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. Also free. Your tax dollars at work again, right? So if you're ever down there, drop on in, and they can't turn you away, right? Leading to this classicism, well, one thing is that we can look at this classicism as being a reaction. Much clearer, much more simple, much less overblown than Mannerist art had been in France. There's a tendency in art for artists to react against their fathers by shifting away from what they were doing towards something entirely different. And Poussin's classicism can be seen as a reaction against Mannerism, in the same way that Mannerism is a reaction against classicism of the Renaissance. Right? So this classicism, on the one hand, is very much a reaction against Mannerism, but this classicism was also being actively supported by the King of France. Louis XIV takes the throne in the 1640s, right around the time of the end of the 30 Years' War. And when Louis takes the throne, he sets up for the very first time the French Royal Academy, right? The Académie Royale de France. And what the Royal Academy was a place for artists to study, okay? To learn how to paint, to learn all of the aspects. Is really kind of like an art school, unlike this simple apprenticeship system, right? And Louis' interest in doing this is he wants to train artists to paint so he can choose the best of them to work for him, right? So the highest level graduates would have a pretty good in with the throne. And the Royal Academy had every 2 years a show of all of the works from the students in the Royal Academy. It was held in part of the Louvre Palace called the Square Room, the Salon Carré. And the Salon Carré gave its name to this annual show, the Salon, the Paris Salon, every other year. And Louis' ministers would go in and they would choose the best works, right? Sometimes they would buy them. Sometimes they would contact the artist and say, I want you for some official projects, right? So Louis wants artists. And at the Royal Academy that he has helped establish, he teaches or has taught classicism. Because that's the kind of art he wants to decorate his palace. So everybody learns at the Royal Academy from the 1640s onward classicism. And Poussin is one of them, right? And so this means when he goes to Italy, who does he become most interested in? Raphael, right? Michelangelo. So this classicism that we see with Poussin replaces Caravaggio, right? In the middle part of the century. It becomes the dominant trend of 17th century French art after the early years. Okay, got that? Okay. Now, the other element of classicism, right? Let's see. Oh, here, look, French Royal Academy, 1648, right? Which I was already talking about. When we talked about Caravaggio, we talked about the fact that he tended to work pretty directly. There are very, very few drawings that survive from Caravaggio because he tended to just dive in and start to paint. And so remember with the St. Matthew that the body is, St. Matthew's kind of skewed, right? The hips don't quite line up because you just go in and start painting, right? And sometimes you work up a little drawing on the canvas, but most of the times it's very, very direct, right? Classical artists, going back to Michelangelo, Raphael, made numerous studies leading up to the final work. I think we talked about this a bit. We saw some of Michelangelo's drawings, right? I mean, work out every detail. And it meant, for example, for the Sistine ceiling, that there's drawings for each one of the figures that's up there. And sometimes there's just studies of the hand, right? Or the foot, to get it just right, to work it out in every possible detail before you start painting. It's a very different way than Caravaggio paints. Okay? This is how Poussin works as well. That he does the study, a number of different studies. I'm sorry, this is the best reproduction of this I could find, right? But he does a number of different studies of the same theme that lead up to the final picture. And as he works it through, and as he works out the different details, it gets stiffer and stiffer. It's much more dramatic early on. We get more diagonals, the figure down below sort of gesturing. And by the end of it, everybody's kind of frozen. And that's kind of a hallmark of Poussin's classicism. And Louis XIV loved this. That's exactly what he wanted, because he wants people decorating his court, and he wants it to be really clear and easy to understand. Right? No crazy Francis I mannerism. Right? So Poussin will work through every possible detail of drawings. He made up little set pieces. He even went so far, after making the drawing and figuring out the composition, he made little clay models. And he would sort of make out of clay. He wasn't firing it in his wet clay. Make the little models, and he would dress them. He'd make them nude first. Then he'd lay the clothing over the top of it to get the drapery just right. And then he'd take a candle with a reflector on it over here and try to light the scene properly. And then make sketches from that as well. Really meticulous in the way that he worked. That led to the final composition. And you can see what happens is it kind of, I'm not a big Poussin fan. It drains the life out of it. It's just sort of really stiff. Right? And that stiffness is, again, accentuated by everything being horizontal and vertical throughout the entire composition. No enlivening diagonals that you see in the original drawings. Right? It's a hallmark of classicism. Right? So Poussin represents for us in late 17th century France, mid to late 17th century France, a different trend from Caravaggio. Right? Two major trends in this. Now, the story at hand. Achilles on Skyros. You've heard about Achilles, right? You know who he is. Achilles, the heel, right? He's impervious in battle because his mother had dipped him in a magical pond that made his skin like armor, right? He can't be killed. Except for the heel, which she held on to as she dipped it, right? That didn't get dipped, and that was his Achilles heel, right? That's the only way you could kill him, would be to get him in the heel. And his mother gets this visit from a prophet who tells her that's exactly what's going to happen to him. He's going to die in battle. He's going to get wounded through his heel and die in battle. How that happens, I don't know, right? But nonetheless. Right? So what does she do? She decides to hide him, right? He's a warrior by birth, but she dresses him up as a woman and sticks him on an island that only women live on. And he's in hiding, right? And as the Trojan War breaks out, spies come, they find out where he's hiding, and they're going to reveal the artifice. They're going to reveal the ruse. And so this group comes with this big box full of gifts for the women on the island of Skyros. And it's clothes, it's full of jewels, right? And fine clothes. And inside of it, they also chucked a shield and a sword and a helmet inside this stuff full of jewels. And as they open it up, all the women on Skyros put on the jewels and the fine clothes. Oh, look at us. And Achilles just dives in, grabs the helmet, grabs the sword, grabs the shield. And we go, ha-ha! You're not a woman because you're not interested in jewels. It's really sexist, right? And so we see him they're all thinking of how beautiful I look with my earrings and all. And he's looking in the mirrors like, how cool I look in this helmet, right? And in the back, they're going, see, there it is, moment of revelation. So even though it's really classical, there's still that Baroque kind of dramatic change, right? The moment of revelation as Achilles is now going to be called up to battle. Right? Another artist who's extraordinarily classical in approach is Claude Lorrain. Who's working on Claude? Yeah, right. Uh, so you're working on this picture, I think, on the right. Yeah. Claude, also a Frenchman, spends time in France, or excuse me, in Italy. Travels there because again, it was quite uh, expected of artists to go to Italy to make the grand tour. And while in Italy, he paints already in the 20s these sort of hazy landscapes of evening light. The sun is setting, dappling the landscape with the ends of the day. And you can see in both of these how kind of conventional its composition is, right? Big, massive trees on the left, waterways leading out to the hazy horizon on the right. Again, the sort of gentle, warm summer light that falls across things. And then staffed with these figures that appear at various sizes in the foreground that enliven the landscape. But it's primarily a landscape, right? He's just kind of given us an excuse to the landscape by including sometimes genre figures in it, like the merchants on the right, and sometimes mythological scenes, sometimes historical scenes, like the images on your left. Right? And given the hierarchy of painting that we talked about, you have to imagine that the Judgment of Paris picture would have sold for more than the merchant picture. But at the same time, a merchant might prefer the one on the right to the one on the left. But again, a conventional approach to landscape. Claude's landscapes all really look very much the same, right? Again, I'm not a huge fan, right? And it's important to remember with these conventions that our artists, our landscape artists, we've looked at him, we looked at Van Ruijsdal, Rembrandt. None of them are really working outside. None of them are setting up easels to paint outside. They're doing it in the studio. Right? Now, Rembrandt might have taken an etching plate out, because it's small, but he's not etching it out there. He's going to take it back to the studio and etch it there, make some changes. Many of his prints have been reworked multiple times, right? As he's getting to the final composition. So, recover it and scratch some more lines and etch it a second time. Right? So most of the creative process is taking place in the studio, not in the outdoors, which is not how we think about painters today, right? Or Rembrandt is a sketch artist, right? Drawing. Why do you suppose that is? Why do you suppose they're not painting outside? Any guess? Lighting? They can control the lighting inside, certainly. And also, I think if you're making a painting to be seen under artificial light or within a room, you would want to paint it within a room because it's going to look different in different kinds of lighting. That's a possibility. It's not the main reason, but I think it's a good idea as well. The big issue is, how did they get their paint? We're used to going down to Dick Blick, or Michaels or something and buying aluminum tubes of paint, right? Those didn't exist before, I think, 1858 or so. We get the aluminum tube of paint. Prior to that, paint was made up on the spot for the day. And you would have a studio system in the back. You would have the powder, right, the raw material. So for blue, it's ground up turquoise, right, lapis lazuli. For reds, might be carmine beetles, make the red. Or for greens, you would get some iron oxide, right? Copper oxide. You grind it up, right? And you would have this powder that you buy from a chemist, and you mix it into the oil, right? And somebody would do that in the studio for you. Like being you guys all do internships. Get the grunt, right? So mixing the paints, and they would only mix up as much as they could use in that day because they dry out, right? And they would store them sometimes in little sacks made out of gut, right? That might keep them overnight. But the idea of going out with enough paints to paint a landscape is it's a physical impossibility in the 17th century. And this is why it doesn't really happen until we get the Impressionists. Because by that time they've got tube paints, right? And they can actually do it. So Claude is making these. Lorraine is the area he's from, right? He's known as Claude Lorraine because his real last name didn't matter when he was in Italy. He was Claude from the region of Lorraine, like Quiche Lorraine, right? From that same region. And he's painting these in the studio, and that accounts for the conventionality of the composition. The fact that he loves to frame it with brackets around the side, with sort of a more brightly lit view through the middle of them, and then our figures sort of arranged in the foreground where the sunlight sort of pools and shows us these different views. Right? So Claude is primarily landscape, right? And many of them look exactly like this. This particular one is also every bit as classical, a lot of sort of horizontals and verticals that anchor the composition. And it shows us the story of the Judgment of Paris. This is a fun mythological story. There was a wedding where all the gods were invited, except for the goddess of discord, the goddess of disharmony. And she got all pissed off that she wasn't invited to this party. And she ended up throwing down a golden apple into the middle of the party with an inscription on it saying, "To be given to the greatest goddess." Hoping that this will get all the goddesses fighting, right? Real housewives of ancient Greece. And a shepherd boy, Paris, picks it up and he reads it, and he's delegated to choose who's the greatest goddess, right? And so the three primary goddesses present themselves to him, and he's going to judge which of them is the most beautiful, right? And each one of them decides to bribe him, right? Because they're all beautiful, one way or the other, right? Decides to bribe him as to who is the most beautiful. And so Minerva is the goddess of wisdom. She's also the goddess of warfare. And she promises that if he chooses her, he will be victorious in battle. And we know this is Minerva because she's got a spear and a helmet next to her, right? Those are her bride. Yeah? Juno, in Greece Hera, is the goddess of heaven. She's very chaste, right? Her husband Jupiter is going out and sleeping with all the mortals he can find, right? So she's in many ways the goddess of domestic fidelity, right? But what she promises him is power, because she's the queen of heaven, right? So she's pointing up toward heaven. You will be as powerful as I am in heaven. And the peacock that she has next to her is a sign of royalty, of heavenly royalty, right? So she's promising him power. Who's the third goddess? Say it. Aphrodite? Yeah, right. Or in Rome, she's Venus, right? The same in Rome. Venus, Aphrodite. She's got Cupid, her son, next to her, right? And what does she promise him? Did you know this story? The most beautiful woman in the world for a wife, right? Because she's the goddess of sex, right? And what do you think he chooses, right? I can have power, I can have victory in battle, I want right? So he goes with Venus. He says Venus is the most beautiful. And apparently, according to Roman mythology, Juno was significantly more beautiful than Venus, right? But he chooses Venus, and of course she's the goddess of love because she's got Cupid and she's naked, right? And you notice the pose, right? Botticelli, right? Titian. We've seen that same pose again and again used for Venus, right? And she's looking to Juno, who is prettier than she is. And I'm going to get it. Now, who does he choose? This is the key element of this story, right? Paris gets to choose the most beautiful woman in the world. He chooses. That's right. He's from Troy, and she's from Sparta, right? Helen, who becomes Helen of Troy. Right? This starts the Trojan War. Right? So the metaphor of this, of course, is, hey, don't give over to physical desire. There's this sort of underlying allegory here. If you give over to your physical wants, there's a lot of earthly danger that comes up, right? And he is basically here starting the Trojan War by choosing love over military victory. Okay, so we've seen here in French Baroque art, we've seen two different trends. Early in the 17th century, we saw a lot of Caravaggio because a lot of artists were traveling during the 80 Years' War, which is over in 1648. After 1648, we see classicism, right? Coming out of two things. One, really on one thing, right? Louis XIV, who has established the French Royal Academy teaching artists classicism. And we see it play out in both Claude and in Nicolas Poussin. We'll pick up with this as well. There's one more thing to talk about with French 17th century art, and that's the presence of Rubens, right? So alongside Caravaggio, classicism, we've got these paintings sitting in Paris. This set of 21 paintings by Rubens, which doesn't seem to have a lot of traction in the 17th century, but does for later art. So we'll pick up with this on, today's only Monday, right? On Thursday we'll pick up on this, and we'll move into the 18th century and see the impact of Rubens there. Don't forget Thursday is your progress reports as well, right, by email.